It is said that the souls of heretics burn bright, for their sin, their corruption, is stripped away in purgation. Let us put this theory to the test. Let your flames be the instrument. Let their cinders be proof of your work. And should the conclusion you reach be unsatisfactory, you need not wait long. For there is no shortage of willing volunteers. So let your curiosity burn, my Cinder Mage. Hello Varlets. As you can see, we have a new intro for this build video. That was another one of my behind the scenes project that I finally managed to cobble together. Those of you who have played Warframe may see the resemblance. This intro was modeled after the prime Warframe trailers, except I don't have nearly as sexy a voice to match. I developed this new intro to give me the freedom to add small narrative components without being bound to anything specific, especially when it comes to using the talent tree as a guide. The main issue with using the talent tree was that as I started doing more and more builds, certain talents kept reappearing, which made coming up with the narrative in some parts very repetitive. This was especially the case for Psykers and Ogryns. Having this new intro allows me to weave in a little more world building and character to the build guide, which is something I already tried to do with the existing talent selection narrative. It definitely takes more work to put together, but I think it adds a little bit more depth to the video than before. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Back to the build. Today we'll be taking a look at the Cinder Mage. It's one of my latest Psyker developments and I'm pretty excited to share this with you. The Cinder Mage is my answer to making the Psyker an all-round useful class that can take on almost every situation on their own, but excels at dealing with all manner of mixed hordes. I actually rarely used the Purgatus Staff in the past because I felt that as a weapon, it was essentially a one-trick pony that was good at clearing hordes and that was it. But with the new talent tree update, I've managed to put together this build, and in doing so, also discovered some mechanics that have made it much more enjoyable to use, and more powerful than most people realize. As a Cinder Mage, you are a very versatile Psyker that can fit into any team. With this kit, you also cover all ranges of engagement as well. This build is also much more of a frontline Psyker than most other builds I've seen and tried. While traditional Psyker builds would much prefer to stay safe in the rear, you have no problems being up close and personal with the enemy given your kit. You also have the ability to wipe out all armor types with this build, and that even includes Carapace, but more on this in the combat tactics section. You of course have incomparable horde clearing. Even mixed hordes are nothing for a Cinder Mage. Everything will get burnt to a crisp just the same. As for our talents, I'll explain my thought process on why a particular talent is selected instead of the usual talent selection narrative. This way, I get to go into more detailed reasoning for taking something, rather than going through every single choice without covering much in the way of rationale. Here is the full talent tree up on display. The game's lantern link to the build will be in the description as well. The core direction of this build is to equip your Psyker to be an all-rounder for any mission. As we are using a Purgatus Staff for this build, we will be picking up Assail as our blitz of choice, and both its related modifiers, Ethereal Shards and Quick Shards to maximize its potential. While the Purgatus has everything covered within 15 meters of you, Assail covers everything else up to around 40 to 50 meters. This gives you an answer for far-away snipers and bombers with Assail's secondary attacks. Assail's spammability also makes it very good for dealing with groups of shooters and shotgunners in medium range, where they are outside the reach of your Purgatus. However, Assail isn't our only answer against shooters. For our combat ability, we're taking Venting Shriek. This gives us a 30-meter stagger that goes through walls and objects, on top of being a safe button against Peril Overload. But by combining this with Creeping Flames, we have the ability to apply up to 6 stacks of Soul Blaze to all enemies hit by Venting Shriek. At 5 stacks or more, all shooters will burn to death if they are hit, giving you another option to dispatch shooters from behind cover. Our keystone of choice is going to be Empowered Psionics. By taking both Overpowering Souls and Charged Up, it further enhances our Assail to be much more effective at dealing with enemies outside the Purgatus Staff's range, especially against elites and specials like Flamers and Gunners. By combining this with Perilous Combustion, your Assail Shards are capable of wiping up groups and patrols of Shotgunners and Gunners too. You could argue that Warp Siphon and Infire Reborn would provide more synergy with the build. and while that is probably the case, taking Empowered Psionics provides more balance to your kit, since a sail doesn't really benefit that much from warp charges, and the Purgatus in of itself is already very strong in what it does. Higher uptime on Vending Streak is great, no doubt about it, but by having good para management and discipline, especially when coupled with solidity, you won't really have to use Venting Streak as a safe button as often as you might think. On the defensive side of things, Kinetic Deflection works very well with one with the Warp. Being able to redirect attacks to your peril means you can block for longer. As your peril increases, you gain more and more toughness damage reduction, which makes you more durable. Since we don't have access to Psykinetics Aura, taking Seer's Presence gives us a little more cooldown reduction to keep Venting Streak available as often as we need it to be. As for our toughness regeneration talents, I think Soul Stealer and Quietude are the usual pickups in any peril-based build, so not much explaining needed on these two talents. We'll be picking up Metal because it works very well with builds that have rapid attacks like the ticking of the Purgatus Staff and the spamming of Assail Shards. This gives us another way to regenerate toughness but also improves our mobility as well. We'll also take Perfect Timing for the same reason. It's essentially free warp damage in this build. Those were our talent choices. Hopefully that explanation helped you understand why I picked certain talents over others and my thought process behind it. Now let's move on to weapon selection. As mentioned, this build will be focused around using the Purgatus Staff. We'll get into the nitty-gritty of the mechanics of the staff in the combat tactics section, but for now, let's learn about how we're going to build it. As far as stats go, the most important stat that's going to affect the damage output of your Purgatus Staff is the burn stat. This stat affects how many stacks of Soul Blaze you can apply from the staff alone. Ideally, you should strive to get one that can reach the maximum of 15 stacks, which is around 75 to 76%. Keep that in mind and keep an eye out for it. As for blessings, an anchor blessing you can't go wrong with is Warp Flurry. This allows you to get fully charged attacks off more consistently and greatly improves your ability to apply stacks of Soul Blaze to more enemies for longer periods. The next blessing, in my opinion, is a choice you can make. If you look around and ask about, the answer you most certainly get is Warp Nexus. This makes practical sense since critical hits apply 2 stacks of Soul Blaze instead of 1. This is technically an increase to your DPS because you reach the 15 stack cap faster. But for me, I don't think I would enjoy the Purgatus Staff as much as I do now if I didn't have Run and Gun on it. That's right, I have Run and Gun on my second blessing because it gives me the ability to turn my Psyker into a sort of Warp Fire battering ram. Because the primary attack of the Purgatus Staff has much more stagger power than its charge attack, with Run and Gun, you can rush into a group of enemies while spamming your primary fire to stagger them constantly. This allows you to close the gap to get into melee and even allows you to keep up with your more melee-centric allies by providing them literal supporting fire. Give it a try and see if you like it. As for perks, because the Purgatus Staff can disintegrate basically all regular enemies, your focus will be on building up damage against more resilient ones. Flak damage is a must in my opinion, simply because this armor class has a lot of durability against Soul Blaze damage. After that, unyielding damage might be a decent consideration, since Ogryn enemies and monsters have the health pool to take lots of Soul Blaze damage. However, because it's often much better to max out your Soul Blaze stacks on monsters with the Purgatus and then switch to your melee weapon to further increase your damage output, unyielding damage on the Purgatus won't be as useful compared to it being on your melee, since the Soul Blaze damage will inherit the perks from your melee weapon when you switch. For this reason, I have chosen to take elite damage to further amp up my strength against tougher enemies in general. For our melee weapon of choice, I have chosen the Deimos Force Sword to be the perfect weapon for this build. If you are a long-time viewer of my channel, you may have seen the Deimos Force Sword review from a long time ago. In it, I showcase how Uncanny Strike was one of the most powerful blessings for the Force Sword because of how it interacted with the Force Strike. Even today, this remains true. Uncanny Strike gives the Deimos the ability to ignore all damage resistance, turning even Carapace armor into cardboard. The bare minimum you'd want your Uncanny Strike to be is tier 3, because this allows a full stack to give you 100% rending on your attacks, granting you the capacity to ignore all damage resistance from armor. Depending on the damage resistance value, anything above ignoring 100% will grant you a small damage boost instead. The next blessing, similar to the Purgatus, is open to several choices. Many guides and advice from other players might say go for Executor or Unstable Power, Slaughterer, Shred, and even Superiority. These choices are not wrong and will provide you with a power boost in one way or another. But for me, I love utility and opening up my build to cover more aspects rather than piling on more damage. So, for my Deimos, I go for Deflector instead. This blessing fills a hole in our kit and covers up a key weakness of the build. Because we don't have Dome Shield or any shield of any kind, we are pretty vulnerable to ranged enemies. Deflector allows you to tank range attacks whenever you need to, acting as a personal Telkine shield of sorts. Combined with Kinetic Deflection and one with the Warp, range attacks will be blocked and stamina costs redirected into our peril. The more we block, the more peril we build, the stronger one with the warp becomes, further increasing our toughness damage resistance, making us a lot more durable against getting shot. As part of this build, Deflector allows us to access our defensive talents when we need it to work the most. For perks, the only enemies that can really stand against a Deimos' attacks are Crushers and Maulers, as they have the health pool and armor to last a little longer than the rest. And because we will always want to try and strike them in the head to build up stacks of Uncanny Strike, taking Carapace damage will help us a good deal here. Carapace damage will also help us in another way, which I will cover in the combat tactics section. Since we don't have something like Shred to help us with monster damage when we swap to the sword from the staff, Unyielding damage serves to increase the direct damage output of the Deimos and the indirect damage of our Soul Blaze when we switch from the Purgatus. If you don't manage to get Unyielding damage, then the next best perk would be Elite damage, since these will be enemies that you'll be using the Deimos against the most. For our Curios, I have chosen a balance of Stamina, Toughness and Health. Stamina works very well with Deflector and Kinetic Deflection, allowing you to block for much longer. More stamina also allows you to make the most of run and gun for your Purgatus. Additional toughness gives us a small boost to our pitiful base toughness so we can tank at least one volley of shots from shooters, giving us some time to react by drawing our melee out to block or to dive for cover. More health is always good, so not much explanation here. For our perks, I've opted to take 3 toughness regeneration speed to keep our toughness topped up as often as possible, and as quickly as possible when we can't depend on our talents to regenerate it. I've also chosen to take a couple of gunner resistance perks and a single sniper resistance perk. If you roll a 21% health Curio, a 20% sniper resistance perk will give you enough resistance to tank 2 hits and leave you at 1 HP. This is just a little unnecessary min-maxing on my end, otherwise you can just replace it with another gunner resistance perk. For my last set of perks, I have taken a couple of sprint efficiency perks and a single stamina regeneration perk. This lets me make the most of my stamina and run and gun, giving me the option of diving into the fray alongside my Zealots and Ogrins if I want to. If you aren't using run and gun, you can replace these perks with whatever you'd like. Now, let's move on to the combat tactics section of the video. Here, we will be learning how to really maximize your potential with this build and loadout, and at the very least, giving yourself more cards in your hand to play in different situations. Combat tactic number 1. Soul Blaze stacking. While the Purgatus Staff has a maximum stack limit of 15, there is a global Soul Blaze stack limit of 31, same as burn stacks. To reach above 15 stacks, you need to apply Soul Blaze from other sources, which in the case of this build, can come from 2 places, Perilous Combustion and Creeping Flames. Enemies that get hit by either abilities can push beyond the 15 limit of your Purgatus, further ramping up the damage over time. Here's the catch. To exceed the 15 stack limit, you have to first reach the 15 stack limit with the Purgatus. If you apply Perilous Combustion or Creeping Flames before hitting 15 stacks, the Soul Blaze from the Purgatus will not be able to exceed 15 stacks as that is the maximum burn stack limit of the weapon. So, if you really want to bring the heat, make sure to max out the Soul Blaze from your staff first before applying more from other sources. Combat tactic number 2. Deimos Stagger Multitool. The Deimos is a very powerful weapon not just because it has one of the strongest damage profiles for a melee weapon. It is also a very powerful single target CC weapon as well. First, you have your Force Strike, which stuns whatever you hit and deals heavy damage to it. Secondly, the second heavy attack of your heavy chain deals massive amounts of stagger, capable of knocking a Crusher out of its overhead attack and onto the floor. And lastly, you also have the Force Push. This is the push attack of all 4 swords and it is incredibly strong but I feel is very underappreciated by many. The Force Push is capable of knocking down Maulers and Rages out of their attacks and can even knock down a Crusher with a couple of pushes. What's more, you can do this from up to 9 meters away. This gives you the ability to thin down a wall of armor without getting too close. You can even chain into the second heavy thrust from your Force Push, letting you knock enemies to the floor or opening them up before dealing a devastating blow. This brings us to the next mechanic. Combat tactic number 3. Soul Blazing Carapace. Earlier, I talked about how Uncanny Strike is capable of removing all damage resistance from Carapace armor. By first stacking up Soul Blaze on a Crusher and then building up stacks of Uncanny Strike, you can force it to take the full damage from Soul Blaze. The question is, how would you go about stacking Uncanny Strike? You could of course, Force Strike the Crusher to build up stacks, but if there's only one Crusher to deal with, you might as well just use your Force Sword to deal with it anyway. If you have to deal with multiple Crushers, you could Force Strike any enemy to build up Uncanny Strike stacks as well. This is a safer method since you don't have to risk exposing yourself to the Crusher pack. But what if you don't have any safe targets to Force Strike? What if there are too many Crushers or you have to deal with monsters and a Mix Horde at the same time? How do you refresh and maintain the 3.5 second timer of Uncanny Strike? This is where the Force Push comes back into the equation. Because the Force Push always causes a weak spot hit, you can build up stacks of Uncanny Strike from a distance. This allows you to build up Soul Blaze on Crushers, switch to your Deimos, and then spam Force Pushes to knock Crushers around to build up stacks of Uncanny Strike. By building up even more stacks of Soul Blaze with Creeping Flames, as we learned in the first mechanic, you can actually deal a pretty respectable amount of damage to Carapace armor, especially if you build your Deimos with Carapace damage. With this mechanic, you can reliably take down Crushers with Soul Blaze damage alone. Of course, just waiting for Soul Blaze to do its thing is going to take a while, but what you can do to increase the lethality of the combo is chaining the Force Push into the Heavy Thrust and going for headshots. This not only helps speed up killing Crushers, but it also provides you with more CC since every hit you land is likely to knock down a Crusher while refreshing Uncanny Strike. On individual Crushers, this isn't a very useful tactic, but if you are ever faced in a situation where you are alone against many Crushers, for example, learning and practicing this tactic can save yourself. Here's a full example of me facing off against 8 active Crushers on Damnation without getting hit and putting everything I've talked about to use. Not bad, huh? From Soul Blaze being entirely worthless against Carapace, to dealing the majority of damage against them and actually killing them. Combat tactic number 4. Bulwark Breaking. One of the most annoying enemies for a Purgatus Staff to deal with are Bulwarks. The Purgatus Staff alone cannot break open a Bulwark, even with the primary attack. However, you do have a handful of tools to deal with them with this build. The first is using your Force Strike of your Deimos. Hitting a Bulwark with it won't deal any damage, but it will stun them, causing them to drop their guard. The other method is to use your Venting Shriek. Since the Stagger strength scales with Peril, you can stagger Bulwarks open by pushing up your Peril and then casting Venting Shriek to break them open. This then gives you the Peril capacity to spam your Purgatus primary attacks to continue stagger locking the Bulwarks. The last method is to use your Assail to stagger them. Direct attacks with Assail won't do anything to Bulwarks most of the time, but casting your Assail upwards or far to the side will cause the shard to travel to exposed parts of the Bulwark, staggering and opening them up for more attacks. Alright, that brings us to the end of this build video. This one took a really long time to make, not only because of Christmas, but because I wanted to thoroughly explore the potential of the build instead of just covering a generic Purgatus and Deimos build with nothing to learn from. This build works perfectly well on Auric Maelstroms and even better if paired with someone using a Storm Witch. Again, let me know what you think about this build guide format, with the narrative component at the front in the form of a cinematic trailer and narration, instead of the usual talent selection narrative. I'm always experimenting with different ways of doing things, so your feedback is valuable to me. See you all in the comments below. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Varlets.